Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and this is my wrap-up for October, or should I say for Victober, because yes, 3 out of the 4 books I read this month were indeed Victorian literature. And for that occasion, here is my special Victober edition of my usual small booktuber shoutouts, in which I always highlight 3 small booktubers that I've particularly enjoyed this month. All 3 of these wonderful channels have been putting out some fantastic Victorian literature related content. So if you've not had enough of your 19th century classics yet, definitely check them out. The first channel I want to recommend is Rachel's Reading Corner. Rachel uploaded a few Victober related videos this month, including one where she did the Try a Chapter challenge to pick her next Victorian read. She has a really fun, relaxed style in her videos and generally seems very easygoing and approachable. Her picks for Victober were authors that I was interested in, like Thomas Hardy, who I've not read yet, and she also read some of the same books that I read this month. When she's not doing Victober, Rachel reads a lot of different genres outside of classics, and it's always fun to explore all sorts of books with her. The second shout out goes to Tilly from Tilly's Shelf. She has so far only uploaded 2 Victober themed videos, but wow, are they worth watching. In those 2 videos, she covers the first 2 decades of the Victorian period and talks about not just the literature, but also the wider historical context of that literature. Watching Tilly's videos, not just the Victober ones, is like listening to your favourite teacher talk about a subject that they're really interested in. She does these long, super informative lecture-style videos that teach you a lot because she puts an enormous amount of effort into the research and presentation of those videos. At the same time, though, they are always incredibly interesting and very entertaining to watch. And my last recommendation is for Tired Mama Likes to Read. This channel is run by Charlotte, who uploaded some fantastic Victober vlogs this month. Her Victober reading was an interesting mix of the popular and the obscure, and I've especially enjoyed following her journey of rereading Jane Eyre. Charlotte is very well spoken in a casual and chatty way and talks about so many little things in relation to her reading. For example, the difference between reading for pleasure and reading for academic discussion, and when we need to stop and think about which of the 2 we are currently doing when we read Victorian literature. All 3 channels are linked in the description box and you should go and check them all out for some really fantastic booktube content. Okay, now for the wrap-up. I read 4 books this month with an average rating of 3.25 stars. This was a month of ups and downs, and while I did discover a new favourite, there was also one big disappointment. The first book I finished, and the only non-Victorian book I read this month, was The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. Many consider Doyle to be a Victorian author, but this last collection of Sherlock Holmes short stories was actually published in 1927. I listened to the audiobook read by Stephen Fry, and like all of the other later Holmes works, I gave this one 3 stars. By the 1920s, Doyle had somewhat run out of original ideas for his mysteries, so a lot of the plots in this story collection sounded strangely familiar to me, and they were clearly inspired by earlier Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm also personally not a fan of the stories set in the 20th rather than the 19th century, because somehow the modern age doesn't seem to suit Holmes and Watson as much as the Victorian age. Overall, this was a fun read, but I would only recommend it to people who are already fans of Sherlock Holmes and his adventures. By the way, if you are interested in reading Sherlock Holmes but don't know where to start, I made a video introducing the canon and giving some recommendations earlier this month, which is linked up here and in the description box as well. The second book I read, and the first specifically for Victober, was The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. This was the first novel by H.G. Wells that I read, and I picked it purely because it's such a well-known work. I have never seen any of the adaptations of this book, so I went into it not really knowing the plot at all. All I knew was that this was one of the first works of fiction detailing an alien invasion on Earth, and as that, it was quite interesting. The The way the Martians are described and the way the invasion unfolds certainly originated a lot of alien invasion tropes. The book is split into two parts, both set in and around Essex in England. The first half describes the arrival of the Martians, the way their spaceship is mistaken for a meteoroid at first, and then even when the Martians are seen by the humans, how they are not taken seriously as a threat. The second half is the tale of war and how the Martians destroy and subdue the humans with their technologically advanced weapons and machinery. As a book, this was not really to my taste. It's a well-written and surprisingly fun adventure, but a lot of it is basically descriptions of scenes of war and destructions, and I'm just not that into that sort of action. I would have liked to see more of a dystopian aspect to this, to see how the humans survive under Martian rule, how they rally and resist, but unfortunately that bit is cut short by quite an abrupt ending to the story. I gave this book 3 stars. It is quite fun and very interesting from a history of sci-fi point of view, but purely as a story it didn't really draw me in a whole lot. I'm still going to continue exploring H.G. Wells' body of work. He was quite a prolific author in several different genres, so if you have any specific recommendations, please drop them in the comments below. The next book I finished was North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. It really pains me to say that, but this was one of the most disappointing reads, not just of the month, but of the year for me. I was so convinced that I was going to love this book, based on the frequent comparisons with Pride and Prejudice, which is one of my favourite novels, and also because every booktuber that I've heard talk about it seems to love it so much. I find it difficult to put into words why exactly I was disappointed, especially without talking about specific spoilers, but I'm going to try. Let's start with a short summary. This book follows Margaret Hale, a 19-year-old daughter of a vicar who grew up partly in the rural New Forest and in London with rich relatives. When her father decides to leave the church, he moves his family up to the fictional northern industrial town of Milton. There, Margaret has to adjust to a new life, and she meets a host of new characters, from the Higgins family of workers to the rich factory owner Mr. Thornton, whom Margaret dislikes from the start. As she gets used to life in the north, her assumptions and beliefs about industrialization are questioned, and she's confronted with a whole lot of ideas and concepts that are very different from the peaceful and comfortable life that she's led so far. The concept and synopsis of this sounds like it was written for me. You get instant vibes of a Pride and Prejudice style romance, of misunderstandings and cultural differences that must be bridged, and the book certainly did spend a lot of time addressing those differences, not just between the North and the South, but between the workers and the factory owners, between old money and new, between men and women. No complaints there, these are all things that I love to read about in 19th century fiction. The thing I found really grating and frustrating for the most part, that took the enjoyment out of reading this, was the plot. I can't go into too much detail here without spoiling the plot, but there were a lot of plot points that I found just so lazily constructed that the story of the book felt completely unbelievable. For example, there are so many deaths in this book, all used to make the main character guilty, then miserable, then poor, then rich, and therefore just to change the direction her life is taking at that very moment. The deaths are completely unconnected to each other, and by the 5th or 6th, they just lose their intended emotional impact on the reader, and as characters kept dying, my reaction just became, ugh, not another one. Another thing I didn't get on with, and this is quite an important aspect for me when it comes to novels in general, were the characters. One of the characters that I enjoyed the most was the main character's cousin, a young woman called Edith who gets married at the very beginning of the book, and then we don't hear much from her after that. The main character herself, Margaret, was okay as far as main characters go. She didn't have the strongest voice and identity and was very much a typical Victorian heroine in that she was principled and good and intelligent and kind, but still with her own power and agency. But the character I really did not get on with was Mr. Thornton, the antagonist slash romantic lead of the story. It's like he was trying to be a Mr. Darcy, but without all of the strength of character and charm that made Mr. Darcy such a fantastic romantic hero. And this leads me to possibly the biggest reason why I was so disappointed with North and South. I heard it compared to Pride and Prejudice so much that I was expecting a similarly brilliant level of literary craftsmanship, and this book did just not deliver that. The plot points felt so contrived and predictable, and the individual strands of plot not nearly as masterfully interwoven as they are in other books of the era. The characters were, for the most part, very one-note, and the emotional appeal of the romance was completely lacking for me. 300 pages in, I could not care less about whether Margaret and Mr. Thornton were ever going to get over the differences. The misunderstandings and tensions and the resolution of those tensions was completely unsatisfying. I just was not emotionally invested in the relationships in this book, both the romantic ones and the family and friendship relationships. It is customary to say in cases like this that the book was good, but just not for me. But this book, at least in concept, sounds exactly like my kind of thing. And that makes it all the more disappointing that I disliked it as much as I did. Overall, this book was just not very well executed, and therefore I did not enjoy it much at all. If it hadn't been for the daily exchange with Andrea from Infinite Text, who buddy read it with me, I would have possibly DNF'd it. The buddy read was fantastic because otherwise I would have felt very alone in this opinion. But she had the same hang-ups and issues as me, and talking about it to her made reading it worthwhile. I will also link Andrea's Victober wrap-up in the description box so you can hear her take on North and South. Since I did read it to the end, it gets a 2-star rating from me. I have by no means given up on Elizabeth Gaskell because, well, there has to be a reason why she is so beloved on BookTube. The next Victorian book I read was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This was the surprise of the month because I did not expect to love it as much as I did. This was the absolute highlight of Victober. It's the first Anne Bronte I have ever read, and I am sure to read the other one soon as well. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is one of those epistolary novels where the form does not get in the way of the story at all, and that is quite an achievement considering that this is written from 2 different perspectives with quite an abrupt change about a third of the way through the book. The story begins as a series of long letters from a man called Gilbert Markham to his brother-in-law, in which he recounts events that happened some decades ago. Gilbert is a young man in a rural, tight-knit community when a mysterious stranger moves into the neighbourhood and rents an apartment in a dilapidated Elizabethan mansion. This stranger is a young widow named Helen Graham who's moved there with her 5-year-old son. She seems very unsocial and, for the standards of the time, very attached to her child. Gilbert is absolutely fascinated by her and tries to find out her secret. As he gets more and more attached to her, unsavoury rumours make the rounds about this mysterious woman. Then we get a break in perspective and the narrative switches to Helen Graham's diary entries from years before her move to Wildfell Hall. They describe a really quite horrible past in which she is stuck with an abusive husband who causes her and her son years and years of suffering. The writing of this book just blew me away. The dialogue is some of the most beautifully written and realistic that I have ever read in a 19th century novel. The main character's diary entries are written with so much feeling and vivid descriptions that you as the reader really feel for her. She's such an interesting person that you want to spend time inside her head and get to know her. The first and last parts that are written from Gilbert's perspective did not draw me in quite as much, but even then, the mystery and the beautiful writing style are enough to make you want to read more. The biggest difference between Anne Bronte's writing and that of her sisters is the humour. Especially the first part of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall has a very subtle type of societal comedy about it, when we get to know the various inhabitants of the village and their gossip and petty little disputes that keep him busy. Markham himself is a slightly silly character too, so even though he is the hero of the first part of the book, we kind of get to laugh at his flaws and mistakes. When the narrative shifts to Mrs. Graham's backstory, the tone gets a lot darker. She has the worst luck with men, and one of the themes of this book is definitely the various ways in which men exert power over women. There's not just her husband who is outright violent, abusive and controlling, but also other men who all try to take advantage of her in different ways, some more subtle than others. The husband, for example, is constantly surrounded by a group of terrible men that he calls friends, in a perfect example of 19th century toxic masculinity. Helen is only a young woman at the beginning of the book, and she gets drawn into the marriage by this handsome, charismatic man. The relationship is so beautifully described. The warning signs of his true character are there from the start, but our heroine is very much groomed into thinking that his abusive behaviour is true love. This relationship builds up in a realistically subtle way, and that makes it all the more believable. We also get to follow two of Helen's female peers as they enter marriages with men in the same circle as her husband, and we get to see how those relationships unfold. Although abuse at the hands of men is a major theme in the book, the focus is still on Helen and on how she deals with it. I love that she is by no means perfect, but reacts in a very human way to the situation she's facing. The same goes for Gilbert. He is a very flawed man, but flawed in a realistic way. The ending, I thought, was a bit too drawn out for my liking, but it did not dampen my overall enjoyment of the book at all. I am going to stop gushing now, but I'm so glad I've found a new favourite with this book. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was a 5-star read for me and the absolute highlight of the month. And these were my Victorian reads. I've had a fantastic Victober, not just reading these books, but also 2 others, which I haven't quite finished yet. The first one is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is an old favourite that I am rereading and annotating, so I'm really taking my time with it. And the other book I haven't finished yet is Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, which I'm listening to on audiobook. I'm really enjoying it, so you'll get to hear my review of that in next month's wrap-up. I would also like to draw your attention to my Victober playlist, which includes all of the Victober related videos that I have uploaded on my channel this month. You'll find this one linked up here and in the description box as well. I did all sorts of videos, from introductions to Oscar Wilde and Sherlock Holmes to a Victorian hair tutorial, because why not? I really loved doing Victober and participating here on BookTube and on Twitter. So thank you very much to the hosts Kate, Katie, and Lucy for organising this fantastic readathon. I can't wait to take part again next year. And before I go, here is my non-book favourite of the month, and it is Minerva. That's not true, it's not actually Minerva, but I mean, Minerva is also my non-book favourite of all times. But this month, my non-book favourite is this jumper that I am wearing. I got it second-hand online, which is where I get most of my clothes. And it's super soft and very warm and a little bit glittery, although I don't think you can see that. Oh, you can. And I love it because, well, Christmas is not that far away now, so we could all do with a little bit of glittery Christmas jumper action. Okay, this was finally it for my wrap-up. This was a very long video. I am definitely going to read some more modern books next month, but I have had so much fun with Victober. How was your Victober? I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Did you find any new favourites, or were you disappointed by any books that you read? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Bye!